In 1602, a group of Dutch merchants created something that had never existed before, not a kingdom, not an empire, but a one that could negotiate treaties, establish colonies, maintain armies, and execute prisoners. A company that didn't answer to a king, but to shareholders. This is the story of the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, and it didn't just change commerce. It invented the blueprint for corporate power that still governs our world today. Imagine a corporation so powerful it could declare war on entire nations, that could mint its own currency, that could execute people for violating its trade monopolies, that operated its own court system across 3 continents, that paid dividends for nearly 200 years straight. Now imagine this corporation was worth more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google combined. Adjusted for inflation, the VOC reached a market value of nearly $8 trillion at its peak. The most valuable company in human history. And it all started with a simple problem: too much competition. By the 1590s, Dutch merchants were racing each other to the Spice Islands of Indonesia, driving up costs and driving down profits. They bid against each other for goods, undercut each other's prices, and occasionally engaged in actual armed conflict with each other. It was capitalism eating itself. The solution was radical: merge all competing Dutch trading companies into one supercharged monopoly. On March 20, 1602, the States General of the Netherlands granted a charter to the Verenigde Indische Compagnie, the United East India Company, the VOC. But here's what made it revolutionary: the charter didn't just grant trading rights. It granted sovereign powers. The VOC could build forts and install garrisons. It could wage defensive wars and sign treaties with foreign princes. It could establish colonies and govern them under its own laws. It could mint coins bearing its own insignia. The Dutch government had created a corporation with the authority of a nation-state, and it unleashed it on the world. To finance this ambition, the VOC pioneered something equally revolutionary: the world's first modern stock exchange. In Amsterdam, anyone, merchants, artisans, even servants, could buy shares in the company. Not a stake in a single voyage, like the old system, but permanent equity in the enterprise itself. This was the birth of liquid capital. Shares could be bought and sold daily. Speculators emerged. Short selling appeared within years. Market manipulation followed shortly after. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange became a mirror of human psychology: greed, fear, euphoria, panic, all quantified in the price of VOC stock. The company raised 6.5 million guilders in its initial offering, 10 times more than its English rival, the East India Company. That capital bought ships, cannons, soldiers, and the infrastructure of empire. Now let's talk about what the VOC actually did with this power. The company established its Asian headquarters in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, in 1619, but Batavia wasn't just a trading post. It was a fortified city with its own government, courts, currency, and military. The VOC's governor-general ruled like a monarch, commanding fleets and armies, executing diplomacy and violence in equal measure. The VOC didn't just trade for spices, it conquered the trade. When the Bandanese Islands resisted VOC monopoly control, Governor-General Jan Pieter Soen Koon responded with systematic extermination. In 1621, VOC forces killed or enslaved nearly the entire population of the island's 15,000 people to secure the nutmeg trade. The company then imported its own labor force to operate plantations under direct VOC control. This wasn't colonial government acting through corporate proxies. This was a corporation wielding sovereign violence to maximize shareholder returns. The VOC could try, convict, and execute people under its own legal system. It maintained a network of prisons across its territories. It fought wars against the Portuguese, the English, and various Asian kingdoms not as an agent of the Dutch state, but as an independent corporate entity pursuing its own interests. And it was phenomenally profitable for nearly 2 centuries. The VOC paid regular dividends, averaging 18% annually. Shareholders became wealthy beyond imagination. Amsterdam transformed into the financial capital of the world. The phrase "going Dutch" originated from this era of prosperity. But here's the crucial innovation that made it all possible: limited liability. Shareholders could lose only what they invested. No matter how many people the VOC killed, how many wars it fought, how many debts it accumulated, shareholders faced no personal consequences beyond their initial stake. This legal innovation severed the connection between profit and moral responsibility. The VOC could commit atrocities on one side of the world while investors in Amsterdam enjoyed clean dividends. The corporate veil had been invented, and it insulated capital from the human costs of its deployment. By the mid-1600s, the VOC operated over 150 merchant ships and 40 warships. It employed nearly 50,000 people worldwide. It governed territories from the Cape of Good Hope to Japan. It had become something unprecedented, a privately owned, profit-driven entity that functioned as a sovereign power. But empires, even corporate ones, eventually fall. And the seeds of the VOC's destruction were embedded in its very structure. The problem was agency. The men who ran the VOC's operations in Asia were thousands of miles from Amsterdam, separated by voyages lasting months or years. They operated with enormous autonomy and faced overwhelming temptations. Corruption became systematic. Officials traded on their own accounts. They manipulated records. They embezzled from company warehouses. Meanwhile, military costs spiraled. Every monopoly had to be defended. Every trade route required warships. Every colony needed garrisons. The VOC's expenses grew faster than its revenues. By the 1780s, the company was borrowing heavily just to pay dividends and maintain the illusion of profitability. Wars in Europe disrupted trade routes. The English expanded their own empire aggressively. Local resistance movements challenged VOC control across Asia, and the company's monopoly, the very foundation of its power, began to crack as smuggling and rival traders eroded its market dominance. In 1799, the VOC formally dissolved, bankrupt and obsolete. The Dutch government assumed its debts and possessions. What had been the world's most powerful corporation became a footnote, then a case study, then a warning. But the VOC's legacy didn't die with it. It metastasized. The model the VOC created, the joint stock corporation with limited liability, tradable shares, and powers approaching sovereignty, became the template for modern capitalism. The British East India Company followed the blueprint and conquered India. The Hudson's Bay Company governed vast territories in North America. Corporations learned to concentrate power while dispersing risk. Today, we live in the world the VOC created. Corporations larger than nations. Markets that determine the fate of governments. Capital that flows across borders while people cannot. The legal fiction that companies are persons with rights but limited responsibilities. When we debate corporate taxation, when we watch companies relocate to tax havens, when we see pharmaceutical companies prioritize patents over pandemic response, when we observe tech giants regulating speech and commerce beyond the reach of any single government, we re-witnessing the evolution of powers the VOC first claimed in 1602. The company that could wage war and mint coins is gone. But its DNA persists in every corporate charter, every stock exchange, every shareholder agreement. The VOC proved that private enterprise could wield sovereign power, that profit could be separated from accountability, that corporations could become more powerful than the states that created them. The first corporate nation didn't just change trade. It changed the fundamental relationship between capital, power, and human society. It showed that you could organize violence and extraction as a profit-seeking venture, shield investors from consequences, and call it progress. For centuries later, we're still calculating whether the dividends were worth the cost. The VOC, where corporate power and sovereign authority first merged and redefined what it means to be powerful in the modern world.